Stephen here at Mission to Mary. I wanted to give everyone a quick workshop and demonstration on how to start your own seeds at home. March is the perfect time to get some of your crops started inside before it's ready to put them out into the garden in April and May. So follow along, I'll show you the supplies you're going to need, two different techniques that we use to start seeds inside, and you can kind of pick the one that works best for your context. And yeah, we encourage you to try it on your own and get ready for gardening season. So come along and we'll show you how we do it in our nursery. Okay, so the materials you'll need are potting soil. We recommend some sort of organic potting soil that has some nutrition in it, since your plants will be in this potting soil for a few weeks. And then you're also going to need some different types of containers. We have commercial trays that are for propagation of different sizes, but I've seen people use yogurt containers, egg cartons, where each little egg carton cell can go where a plant will go. Obviously, if you have a big container, that means there's more soil in there, and your plant can stay in that container for a longer period of time, sometimes up to 8 weeks. In the case of something like this, you could put a tomato in here and it could be pretty happy for almost 2 months. Whereas a smaller cell like this, it's much less soil for each plant, and you should probably only keep the plant in there for 3 to 4 weeks before you transplant it into the garden. You're also going to need some seeds. Today I'm going to show you guys some tomato, San Marzano. It's a paste tomato. You're looking for seeds of plants that you want to transplant, so not something like carrots or radishes, which you would just put directly into the garden. Rather something that needs extra time before the season to get started. So normally it's a crop that takes a long time to grow, and it's normally a fruiting crop, or a crop that takes substantial space in the garden. Broccoli, cabbage, tomatoes, peppers. Those are some things that are a good idea to get started early. And then you'll need some sort of label for your plant so you can remember what is what. And then if you're going to be potting up, you're going to need a little pencil as well. So that's about it. It's pretty basic tools. You're also going to need a growing environment. So we have a nursery, but I have a couple of other examples of growing environments. It's just some simple shop lights or LED lights, or they even have specific growing bulbs and lights which you can buy. But anything that produces the daylight spectrum of light should be fine. And then we just have a racking system, but I've seen folks do this in their basement, or in their spare bedroom or living room. But you can also have just a somewhat sunny windowsill. We grow things up here as well, and as long as they're getting some diffused daylight, that should be good. Another thing to know is that you want a fairly warm space for your plants. Plant growth really slows down, and you can have some fungal and moisture issues if your soil temperature and your air temperature is down in the 50s or low 60s. So we try to keep things a little bit warm. Right now we have things at about 70 degrees, so if there's a warmer spot in your house, that's great. Or there are also, this black mat is a heating mat, and so it just has a small, almost like an electric blanket, that warms the soil from underneath. So that's another thing that you can look into if you're going to go on a slightly larger scale. But really anything to get your air temperature and your soil temperature close to that ideal 70, 75 degree range is good. Is a germination chamber, and we keep this, depending on the seed, but close to 80 degrees, and it's a 100% humid environment. So there's steam pouring out right now. It's very warm and humid in here, and that's the ideal conditions for seeds to germinate. You can see our thermostat there. There's no light that gets into this, but that's okay while plants are just germinating. As soon as the plants start to pop up, I think you can almost see these are starting to pop up just a little bit. You have to take them out into some daylight or under some grow lights. But this is a cool way to get your crops started, and they just pop really quickly in the germination chamber. We have a crock pot with some water in it, and that is what heats the space and also makes it really humid. It's a cool little trick, and the crock pot is just hooked up to the thermostat, and the thermostat tells it when to turn on to maintain that constant temperature of 85 degrees or so. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's two main techniques that we use. The first is to start the seeds in the cell, in the growing spot that they will be for their entire life until they go and transplant into the garden. And that's a pretty simple way to do it. If you've got enough space, you can just start a whole bunch of trays like we do. This is kohlrabi, similar to cabbage or broccoli, but we'll put a seed in this exact cell right here, and it will then grow out of that exact cell, and then when it's ready, it has a nice root ball attached to it, and you can pop it out and go put it right into the garden. So this is a simple way to do it. If you've got big containers like this, you can also do it, as I mentioned, with egg cartons or anything like that, anything that has that individual cell. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is fill up your cells with some soil, just like this. Pretty simple, but you also want to jiggle it a little bit and get all those air pockets down below filled in. And so we're only going to use a little bit of this tray, so I'll just do this. And I just smooth it over, make sure it's all packed down. You want the same amount of soil in every cell, so that way the cells dry out at the same time. So when you're watering, you know, these ones on the edges don't get dry because they have less dirt than the ones in the middle do. So a nice little tip there. The next step is just to get your cells and the soil really nice and moist. So I just run the little sprinkling wand over them a few times, and I let the water kind of percolate and drain down. Sometimes it puddles on top, but you got to really make sure that it's moist all the way through. And sometimes you can check that by just doing a little pencil and making sure you got moisture all the way down into the hole there. So we're looking good. So on to the next step. Okay, so the next step is to actually just make a small depression or a dibble where you're going to put a seed in every cell. So we do that simply with a pencil eraser tip, and I'll just make about a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch deep little dibble. And it's pretty fast and easy. You can even do 2 pencils at a time with both your hands if you've got a lot of holes to make. And then next we're going to drop the seeds right into those holes. Okay, so we've got our tomato seeds here. We've dropped one into each of the holes, and then we're going to just mush those holes closed. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, but you can use a finger or you can use the pencil again. You're just going to close up your holes. Okay, so the next step is just to give it a little more water to make sure those seeds are nice and watered in. And I will say you can sometimes drop more than 1 seed per cell. If you're going to do something like scallions or green onions, or even beets, if you want to start beets like this, sometimes we put many seeds in a cell, and then they can kind of grow apart from each other once you transplant them in the garden, and it works pretty well. So just a tip there, you don't have to do hundreds of these cells if all you're wanting to grow is scallions or something like that. Alright, then you're all done here. You're just going to label this with the variety, and maybe if you got several different crops growing in the same tray, you can make different labels. And then you're going to want to put this in your germination spot. So again, I mentioned you don't need light to germinate these crops. You only need light once they pop up. And so we like to put a tray in a very warm, humid environment. Tomatoes like to germinate at temperatures around 85 degrees. Lettuces, is much cooler, around 65 degrees. But you'll find that most crops want to germinate around 80 degrees. You can find that information online or sometimes in your seed catalog. But we also like to make sure it's a very humid environment, and so we will frequently put these with a bag over top the entire thing. Or if you're in a smaller container like this, we'll put a plastic bag right over top to kind of seal in some of that moisture. And that really helps the soil not dry out while the germinating is going on. And you don't have to constantly monitor the soil to make sure it's staying wet, because you definitely want this to stay completely moist for the entire 3, 4, 5 days it takes for crops to germinate. And it varies on crop. One more quick tip is about watering. So you do not want to have your seedlings, once they've germinated and are growing, consistently wet all the time. They like to dry out a little bit. So you can see over here, got a little bit of dry light brown soil. We like to see that. We want to let the tops of the tray get a little bit dried out before we apply more water. So you can see the same thing over here. And when you apply more water, you sometimes have to wet the entire tray once, let it trickle a little bit, and then wet it one more time to make sure you're getting a deep watering. Sometimes the surface can be wet, but deep down there's actually no moisture. And so you just have to water once, water twice, water 3 times to make sure you get a deep watering. When we do water, we water deeply, but we don't have to water all the time, make sure it's wet all the time. We want them to dry out in between. Okay, one more tip about growing seedlings, and it's right before you put them into your garden. You're excited, you want to get them out there, but you need to do a step called hardening off. And so these kale are just about ready to go outside into the garden, but they've been in a protected nursery environment or in your house under lights or in your windowsill for their entire lives. So when you take them out to the wind, the cold nighttime temperatures, something like that, they can get very shocked. So it's called transplant shock, and it's basically a sharp change from the conditions that they're used to. So hardening off means you're taking your tray outside into the direct sunlight, into a little bit of wind, into slightly cooler temperatures at night especially, and we leave them outside for a couple hours the first day. We try to pick a shady day, not direct sunlight, and then we'll bring them back inside to their protected environment. And we'll do the same thing again the next day for a little bit more time. And then maybe the next day, especially if there's going to be direct sun, we try to get them in the direct sun for a couple hours. And then eventually you want to leave them outside overnight so they can get acclimated to the colder nighttime temperatures that we have in the spring. You don't want to freeze them, but if it's going to be a light frost or a cooler night and it's a cold hardy crop like kale, you can go ahead and leave them outside, and they need to acclimate to that environment. Once you've done the hardening off, sometimes for up to a week, you can go ahead and transplant them into the garden. There's different ways to do it. If you're feeling a little lazy, you can just stick them outside near the garden for a couple hours the first day, and then just leave them outside but in their trays for a couple days if you're going to have nice even weather. Okay, that's it for technique number 1, where you're growing the seedlings in a cell their entire lives. The next technique is called potting up, but you're essentially growing the seedlings in a very small container in a small area. Maybe you don't have a lot of room to keep things warm and moist. And so you can grow in a small area, and then once they've germinated, you can spread them out into a full-size tray. And so we do that with containers like this, yogurt container, or a small Tupperware could work as well. But eventually you want to take these out because they're too close together, they're competing against each other, and you want to put them in something, like this that has space for each individual plant. So I'll show you guys that process. It's really pretty easy, especially if you're only doing a few plants like this. It doesn't take too much time. Okay, so step 1 is just like, our other step 1. We just take our small container and we fill it with our growing medium, our potting soil. You want this to be a nice and fine mix. You don't want a lot of big chunks in it and things like that. So this one isn't perfect, but it'll work for us. You want those fine chunks because you're going to have a lot of seeds in a small area, and you want to have good seed to soil contact throughout your whole tray. And so fine sifted potting soil helps you do that. All right, step 2 is just like before. We're just gonna wet down our potting mix, and we only need a small amount of water with this tiny container, but you gotta kind of let it puddle and drain down as well. You might have to water it a few times. Okay. And then the next step is to take this and you're just going to spread the seeds all over. You're not going to care really where they go. You just want them to be kind of spread out. And so in a container like this, we'll put up to 100 seeds because you're going to be taking them out, in about a week or so. So they can be pretty close together. Okay, and after you've planted your seeds in there, you're just going to take a very small amount of extra potting mix and kind of powdered sugar coat the top of your tray just to make sure you've got moisture underneath your seeds, and then this layer of soil can be moist on top of your seeds. At this point, I also like to press down on the seeds with my fingers or even with another tray that fits inside this one. But you want that nice seed to soil contact. You want to press down nicely on that. Okay, we've watered again to make sure the top of the soil is wet. You're just going to label what you've planted, and then you're going to put this in that same warm, humid, and it can be dark environment It doesn't have to be dark, but it can be, to let them germinate. Again, tomatoes, pretty high temperatures, hopefully 80 degrees, and they will start to pop up in about 4 or 5 days, and they'll be ready for the next step of this process, which is called potting up. Okay, so several days have passed. We've got our tomatoes popping up. We're gonna now pot them up into these individual cells. And so you're gonna do a similar thing. You're gonna make a deep hole for your incoming tomato plant. And then what I like to do is just take a popsicle stick, or some people even use a screwdriver, but I like to use a pencil eraser. And you're kind of breaking them apart, and you're getting this nice root hair on your tomato. And you don't want to snap this stem, and you don't want to snap the roots off, so you kind of have to gently lower it down into the hole and then tuck it in. And I like to get them, it's gonna be tough to see, but I like to get them pretty deep, and so only a little bit of leaf is sticking out. And this helps them not be leggy when they continue to grow. They won't be floppy. They'll be nice and short and stocky and strong. So you're gonna do this for all your tomatoes that popped up. Takes a little bit of time, but you'll get into a rhythm, and you'll just finish those off, and then you're done. Okay, and here is what it looks like when things start to pop up from their individual cells. So you can see these are beets here, but they'll just pop up, and then you want to make sure as soon as they pop up, you want to start getting them under daylight. If you don't do that right away, here's some beets again, but you can see how floppy they are, how they're laying down. These got what you call leggy. They didn't get daylight right away. They didn't get enough daylight, and so their leaves went looking for light. They went stretching and growing, and so this is what you call leggy, and these seedlings are definitely not as healthy as something like this, where they're much shorter and stockier. You want short and stocky seedlings. Okay, now you've got your tray of potted up, in this case broccoli, just like the tomatoes. We can put them into each cell, and you're gonna let this grow with natural daylight or with growing lights until they are ready to transplant out into your garden. A quick note about lights: if you're going to be using grow lights, I would suggest leaving them on for 12 to 16 hours per day. They need a little bit of extra light compared to sunlight that we're getting out here in the nursery greenhouse. If they ever start to get really leggy and floppy, this is okay, but if they start to get really leggy and floppy, just increase how much light you're giving them. One last consideration when you're growing seedlings out like this: they need airflow, and they need those warm temperatures. A lot of times you can get an issue called dampening off, where right at the stem there's a fungal issue, and the plant will just wilt away and die and flop over, and it looks like your stem will have just disintegrated into a tiny little thread. That's called dampening off. It happens sometimes. It means soil's too moist, soil's too wet, and soil not warm enough, and not enough airflow. It can mean any one of those things. So just make sure you have some fans blowing in that area of your house, or you have some good airflow. The soil is warm enough, the air is warm enough, and you shouldn't have any problems. Okay, that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about growing your own seedlings at home. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments here, and I'll try to answer any questions that might come up. When you go to transplant your crops, make sure you water the tray really deeply first. Then go plant them in the garden, and then water really deeply again. That's about it. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Have a great day, and I hope you can do some gardening this year.